What's going on? I am back. Welcome into another episode of the Fantasy Football Fellas podcast. If you're wondering who is this talking right now, well, my name is Tyler Plath. I'm the third member of the Fantasy Football Fellas. Lucas and Cameron have been holding down the fort for the last couple weeks, last couple episodes, but I'm finally back for an episode. We're going to have to wait a little bit longer until I'm back with one of the fellas, but this is sufficient for me. It's so good to be back. It's been too long. Sometimes just life happens and you find yourself reminiscing on the last time you were on an episode with the fellas, and then you're getting the fellas calling you out on episodes like, we need you back. So we made it happen. Again, my name is Tyler Plath, here with you on February 3rd, Friday morning. Happy Friday. Happy weekend to all of you that are listening, viewing, watching, all those ings, you could say. You can check us out on any social platform. You can find us on Twitter at FFFellas. You can find us on Instagram at the FFFellas. You can find us on TikTok and YouTube at Fantasy Football Fellas. And you should be subscribed over on YouTube. And if you're not, you should go do so. Give the video a like. Welcome me back with some likes. Join us down in the comment section. Just your thoughts on this episode, because we're going to be going through the top 10 wide receivers of the fantasy season. We are in the middle. I shouldn't say the middle. It feels like we just started and we're not even done with the Super Bowl just yet, but it feels like we are in the fantasy offseason swing of things, recapping everything, but also paying attention to what's going to happen next in the offseason. Me personally, I'm a big fan of the NFL draft. This past week was Senior Bowl week, was also Shrine Bowl week, so there was a lot of video research, some film breakdowns that I went through just to get a feel for the rookie class that is coming in, right? In your running backs, your quarterbacks, wide receivers, tight ends, all the fantasy relevant players that were showcasing their talents this week that'll eventually get drafted. We should know about them as we're going into draft next year. For example, Bijan Robinson may or may not be a top 10 redraft running back next year already, and he hasn't even been drafted to a team yet. So there's a lot that we'll be going through this offseason. So make sure that you're following along with us. And one of the best ways that you can do that actually is by joining us over on our Chalkboard page, where we are. I want to say, are we just shy, or did we eclipse the 1,700 member mark? As I'm pulling it up right now, and my phone doesn't want to cooperate. That's convenient. How convenient. We are just shy of 1,700 members. So come join us. Come join everyone else, where we are discussing everything football related, whether it is fantasy or just general football. We have an NFL draft channel where we talk prospects. We have a whole bunch of stuff and a whole bunch of tools that will be at your disposal once we get closer and closer to the beginning of the regular season. Trade reviews, draft reviews, weekly rankings that the fellows do every week. Again, I could go on and on about the Chalkboard page, but it is the ideal tool for you if you want to win your fantasy leagues this upcoming year. So go ahead and join us over on Chalkboard, completely free. You can find the link to that in the description of the video. With that, as tradition, I should say, let's just get into some news and notes of the week. I'm really hoping that transition came through. If it didn't, that is such a disappointment. We're trying to up the production, up the quality of the show here, and this was a first go at it. And if it didn't work, well, that stinks. But you win some, you lose some. So again, news and notes this week. most recent news, within the last couple days since the last episode dropped, we found out that Tom Brady has retired, in his words, for good. Um, Happy retirement to the GOAT. I think that's the only thing we can all say. I know some people will be happy that he's gone because, the years of, you know, suffering by the hand of Tom Brady. Um, but I think at the end of the day, when you take a step back, we can all agree he is the GOAT of the NFL. He's the best, the greatest winner in football, Super Bowls, stats, records, all that kind of stuff. Um, it- he's the GOAT. So, happy retirement to Tom. I know Lucas is very, very sad. So, if anything, you guys can actually drop in the comments just a nice little note wishing Lucas well, just because Lucas just loves Tom Brady. And I think that news has kind of hit him at the heart a little bit, just tugged the heartstrings a little bit. So leave him a nice little comment down below. Next piece of news. It's a relatively serious piece of news. Joe Mixon, it was reported last night, Thursday night. I want to say Thursday night. That there was a warrant out on Joe Mixon for aggravated menacing. And if you don't know what that is, it's essentially causing another person to believe that you're going to, physically harm them, property, um, unborn children. Even it gets into that kind of extremes. Um, and there was a warrant out for Joe Mixon last night. Um, Mixon's agent came out later last night and said that the charges were going to be dropped Friday morning. So this morning, supposedly, allegedly, the charges were dropped. But it is something to kind of keep an eye on. No one really knows how much of a legal process is going to affect a player going forward. I mean, we all knew Kamara in his whole Pro Bowl situation last year. No one really knew, what was going to happen with that. And then we all found out, like, right at the beginning, towards the beginning of the season, that court case had been pushed back and that he was going to be able to play and all that kind of stuff. So just keep an eye on that situation as we're getting closer to the fantasy season, because this is not the first time that Joe Mixon has been having some legal issues before. So again, just keep an eye on that as we're getting closer, because that could mean some fallouts and, lower rankings and drafting, all that kind of stuff. So something to keep an eye on, something that we will keep an eye on, especially. More positive news. We have 2 new head coaches in the NFL. DeMeco Ryans and the Houston Texans agreed on a 6-year contract to become the franchise's new head coach. Congratulations to DeMeco Ryans. I feel like he was the one coach that was not talked about a whole lot, but he was one of the best candidates out there. And it didn't really help because the Niners are playing in the playoffs, and before getting just smacked around by the Eagles, he was very focused on what he was doing with the Niners. But you look at the body of work and you look at the leadership, and you, again, like, just everything that you want in a coach, DeMeco Ryans has. And this is a home run hire for the Texans. I think we all thought it was a possibility just because Ryans is a former Texan. And so it was easy to kind of correlate the two to be like, well, it would make sense for him to be the head coach. But I don't think many people expected that the Texans to go ahead and actually hire him just based off of what they did with David Culley and Lovie Smith. But a 6-year contract is pretty, it's pretty telling. So DeMeco Ryans, new Houston Texans head coach, and the second new head coach, it's not confirmed yet, but it seems very, very likely that Sean Payton is making his NFL return, and he will be the Denver Broncos head coach. It was reported, I want to say back on Wednesday, I think it was, that the Broncos and the Saints had agreed or were discussing compensation for Sean Payton. And it seems to be that the Broncos will be trading their first round pick this year and a second round pick next year in return for Sean Payton and a third round pick next year from the Saints. That's the reported deal that's going to be agreed upon. And it's seen, and again, seems likely now that Sean Payton will become the Broncos head coach. Nothing has been confirmed yet, but when you have the Schefters and the Rappaports of the world all talking, confirming it, essentially, it's a pretty done deal. So Sean Payton now gets to work with Russell Wilson. He has weapons like Courtland Sutton, Jerry Jeudy at his disposal. Am I ready to get hurt again by by Broncos players in fantasy? We'll see. We'll see. we're still ways away. We don't need to go down that road right now. Last piece of news. Derek Carr said he has no intention of extending the February 15th trigger date in his contract to give the Raiders additional time to resolve a situation. He's essentially forcing the Raiders to make a decision before February 15th. And this came out after Derek Carr won the precision passing competition at the Pro Bowl in Vegas. Talk yo talk. That's what I'm talking about, Derek Carr. Look, I think I speak on behalf of Cam and Lucas on this one. We don't really think, we don't rank Derek Carr super highly in terms of all the NFL quarterbacks, but Derek Carr has these little moments where you're just like, yeah, talk yo talk. And this was one of them. And so I'm a big fan of Derek Carr. Maybe not for fantasy, but just in general. Derek Carr is just a good dude, and I love seeing this. That he's frustrated with the Raiders and how he's been treated and stuff, and he's kind of giving them a taste of their own medicine. So that's fun to see. So again, that's news and notes. And now for the meat and potatoes of the episode. Let's go through the top 10 fantasy wide receivers, starting at 1 and going all the way to 10. And again, I tried to transition, hoping it works. If not, it's okay. We'll figure it out down the road. So, top fantasy wide receivers. Starting with number 1, we're just going to get right into it and just roll right on through. Number 1 wide receiver this year in fantasy football. None other than Jay Jettas himself, Justin Jefferson of the Minnesota Vikings. Jefferson played in all 17 games this year. He eclipsed the 1,000 snap count, and he had almost 130 receptions on 181 targets, which is nuts. He tallied a little over 1,800 receiving yards and 8 touchdowns. And there was a point in the season where there was a legitimate chance for Justin Jefferson to break the single season receiving record set by Calvin Johnson. There was a chance that he could eclipse the 2,000 yard mark. But he burned a lot of people in fantasy playoffs. So there's a sour taste in people's mouths just how the season finished for Jefferson. But besides the last 2 games of the season, if I'm remembering his stat line correctly, the man was exactly what everyone hyped him up to be. He had 9 finishes inside the top 5 wide receivers in weekly finishes. He had 7 games with 30 or more fantasy points. He had the most receptions, targets, yards out of all the receivers this year. And he really, one of his goals at the beginning of the year was to become the kind of consensus number one receiver in the entire league, to be the best wide receiver in the league. And I think after this year, I think there is a very, very strong argument for Jefferson that he is the best. And being a biased Vikings fan, I am going to say that he's the best. um, but I think he won over a lot of people this year with his performance, and not really expecting it to slow down anytime soon. Um, he's going into year, oh my word, he's going into year 4, is he not? Yeah, he's going into year 4. That's crazy. Um, but again, going into year 4, this is the first time that he and a lot of Viking offensive players are going to have the same scheme, the same play caller in consecutive years. So we're not really. I am me for for sure. Me, I'm not really expecting things to slow down. I think the kryptonite is out there in terms of how to slow down Justin Jefferson. Um, and it's a lot of double teams, it's a lot of bracket coverage, a lot of safety high coverage. Um, and when I shouldn't say safety high. Obviously, the safeties are going to be high, but there's a safety shaded over towards Justin Jefferson. So if it's a deep route, Jefferson gets doubled. So, like I said, the kryptonite is out there that if you can double Jefferson, and it's not really just doubling him, it's playing him in press coverage, because I think we all can remember Jair Alexander just putting Jefferson in a bag the entire game against Green Bay. That's because Jair got to press him at the line of scrimmage and got to get his hands on him and be able to kind of push him out of Jefferson's releases and stuff. So um, it's out there, but I think you should believe in the talent of Justin Jefferson at this point to not think of that as too much of a negative for him, that he's going to be able to find a way to kind of break out of that um that negative narrative that he can't handle double coverage and stuff. So I can pretty much tell you, and pretty much everyone else, he's probably going to be one of the favorites for the first overall pick next year in fantasy drafts. Just again, when you have 9 finishes inside the top 5 and you have 7 games with 30 or more fantasy points, and especially with how the running backs performed this year, it would not surprise me at all if Jefferson is the number 1 pick in fantasy drafts next year. On to the second wide receiver of the year, Tyreek Hill on the Miami Dolphins. And I don't think a lot of people envisioned Tyreek and Jalen Waddle, who we will get to later on in this episode because they both finished top 10. I don't think a lot of people thought Tyreek would be able to finish top 5, for sure top 3. Going from Patrick Mahomes to Tagovailoa. I don't think many people really thought that was a possibility, but he proved everyone wrong. And I think the best part about this, as I read off his stat line, I'll leave the best part of it for last, because it puts a lot, right? It gives perspective as to just how good Tyreek was this year. Tyreek played in all 17 games. He was one shy of 120 receptions. He had 170 targets, just over 1,700 receiving yards, 7 receiving touchdowns, but no more than 800 snaps on the year. He played 767 snaps on the year, which is crazy to think about. You have Jefferson that went over 1,000 snaps. Devontae Adams, we'll talk about him next. He had 1,000 snaps. Several receivers had over 900 snaps. What Tyreek did this year with his snap count is beyond impressive. And I'm not going to sit here and debate, who had the more impressive season between Jefferson and Tyreek and stuff, because they both had fantastic seasons in their own regard. But take a second to just kind of marvel at the fact that Tyreek played, quick maths, almost 280 something snaps less than Justin Jefferson, and was pretty much with him in terms of receptions and targets and yards and touchdowns. Those numbers, he was with Jefferson for majority of the year on almost 300 snaps less than Jefferson. That's incredible. Tyreek was one of 3 wide receivers to have a target share greater than 30% this year, if I'm not mistaken. Devontae Adams was the other, and Cooper Kupp also did before he got hurt and stuff. But that kind of target share number is very, very encouraging going forward. If Tua can stay healthy, Tyreek is going to be a very, very valuable fantasy asset to have. Tyreek also led the league in air yards, and he accounted for 41% of the team's air yards, which is crazy. So there's a lot of big play potential with Tyreek, and we all knew that, obviously. But I think what this year confirmed is that big playability is still there, even with Tua as his quarterback. So you can give Tua his flowers for sure, but Tyreek also gets his, because Tua doesn't have the season he has without Tyreek, and likewise, Tyreek doesn't have the season he has without Tua. So on to number 3, Devontae Adams of the Las Vegas Raiders. 17 games this year, 2 snaps over 1,000. He had 100 receptions on 180 targets, just over 1,500 receiving yards, and 14 receiving touchdowns. And those touchdowns led all wide receivers. Devontae had a very interesting season, and in partially, it's the Derek Carr effect, we'll call it. Getting 180 targets, you'd like that reception number to be somewhere closer to like 120. I mean, you look at, again, Tyreek had 120 on 170 targets. Jefferson had 130 on 180. So you would, I think a lot of people wished that Devontae Adams caught 20 more, but we don't really know, if it's Derek Carr missing him. And I think a lot of people, that's what we'll expect, just because Devontae Adams doesn't really drop that many balls. He does drop a few, but not 20 some. I think to give that just more perspective, though, Devontae Adams had the lowest catch rate out of the top 20 wide receivers in fantasy this year. And again, catch rate is not it's not a stat that measures how many balls a receiver caught and dropped. But again, it's more so your receptions over your targets. Devontae Adams had a catch rate of 56%. And you do the math, that's everyone else pretty much in this top 10 list is closer to 70, maybe even 65, 60 at the lowest. But Devontae had 56% of his targets that were caught. So I think a lot of people are hoping that Devontae Adams can get an upgrade at quarterback, just because it's pretty much a foregone conclusion that that Derek Carr's leaving. And again, he's going to force his way out because that bridge has burned. Um, but I think one of the questions you have to ask is what is the value next year with no Derek Carr, right? Even if Derek Carr isn't as, I mean, Derek Carr isn't one of the better quarterbacks in the league. I think we can all agree on that. He's still solid enough to, and he can support a wide receiver like Devontae Adams, who gets 100 receptions, 180 targets, all that kind of stuff. So what's his value next year? Like if the Raiders were to draft one of these rookies, right? Bryce Young, CJ Stroud, Will Levis, that value kind of takes a hit just because I don't think those rookie quarterbacks can be as good as Derek Carr is right now. Not saying any of those quarterbacks will be better, because I think they will be better than Derek Carr down the road. But in terms of just when you look in next year, Derek Carr is still a very intriguing option when you compare those quarterbacks. And obviously, that's going to be a bold take and all that stuff. But again, there's chemistry between Derek Carr and Devontae Adams that helps put up the stat line that Adams had. So where's that value? I think Devontae is still going to be a top 10 wide receiver. I don't know if I can necessarily slot him in top 5 at this point, just because, again, chemistry and not knowing who that quarterback is going to be. That's going to be very interesting to watch this offseason. That's our top 3. Justin Jefferson finishes the wide receiver 1 overall. Tyreek was the wide receiver 2. Devontae, the wide receiver 3, and the wide receiver 4, to really no one's surprise, I think. Stephon Diggs. Diggs played in 16 games. He had 800 snaps, 110 receptions on 150 targets, 1,400 yards on 11 touchdowns, and I'm rounding again on those numbers for clarity's sake. But I think a lot of people don't talk about Stephon Diggs enough in fantasy. Did you know that that Stephon Diggs was a wide receiver 1 from weeks 1 to 13? He was a wide receiver 1 with the likes of Tyreek Hill, with the likes of Devontae Adams, Justin Jefferson, Cooper Kupp when he was still healthy. Diggs was a wide receiver 1 in those weeks. And then his season got marred by a 4-week stretch where he was a wide receiver 60. It was even below Gabe Davis, who was a wide receiver 57 in that same 4-week stretch from 14 to week 8, from week 14 to week 17. He averaged almost 20. What was it? 26? No, I don't remember what he was averaging in weeks 1 through 13, but enough to be the wide receiver 1 overall. But from weeks 14 to 17, he was only averaging 6.7 fantasy points a game. That is brutal. That's brutal for a guy that was a wide receiver 1 for majority of the season, or at least in the top 3, top 5. That's a brutal stretch. And he's already someone that I'm going to start targeting in drafts for next year. Because if his 2022 season finish drops his price tag or drops him in rankings and in drafts and stuff, because again, he put up almost 6.7 fantasy points a game. I'm hoping that his finish is going to push him down the draft board a bit, because I know what I'm getting with Diggs, right? Yes, it is always going to be on your mind that he could have a stretch of games like this, or he could have every other, the odd game every now and then where he's putting up really not so great production. But all the other weeks, sign me up. Sign me up. wide receiver 1 from weeks 1 to 13 this year. I want that on my team. I want that on my team. I will take the bus because if I'm going to take the bus weeks, that means I get every other boom week, and that's what I want. I want scorers on my fantasy teams. So, like I said, Diggs is already someone that I'm kind of watching a little more closely this offseason. If Buffalo finds a wide receiver in the draft, you could say a Jordan Addison, Jackson Smith and Jigba, or they sign a free agent. And there's not really there's not really super great wide receiver options in free agency this year. But even if like Buffalo decides to take Bijan Robinson in the draft this year, right? That helps out Diggs. So he's going to be someone I'm watching, or I'm going to watch closely this offseason, because again, if his bust performances are going to drop him in draft boards, that's awesome, because that's such a value for a guy that was a wide receiver 1 from weeks 1 to 13 this year. I'm going to keep repeating that whenever I talk about Stephon Diggs, because again, that's value. That's value. Everyone's looking for the guy that's going to average 25 a week. There's maybe 1 or 2 guys that do that. Everyone else, you kind of have to you have to weed through who are the fakers, who are the posers, and who are the guys that are actually for real. A lot of people may say that Diggs is closer to a poser than anything. But I will take all of the boom weeks that I get with Diggs, because a boom week in a stretch of weeks, again, 1 to 13, he's a wide receiver 1. I've spent too much time on Stephon Diggs. I hope you get the point. He's going to be someone that you should be looking at next year in drafts. Wide receiver 5 on the year. Let's go over to Dallas. Mr. CeeDee Lamb finished as your wide receiver 5 this year. 17 games, a little shy of 1,000 snaps. Had 107 receptions, 156 targets for just a little over 1,350 receiving yards, 9 receiving touchdowns. This was the CeeDee Lamb breakthrough that we were all hoping for at the beginning of the season, right? When the Cowboys traded Amari Cooper, everyone was going, man, CeeDee Lamb could have a breakout season, and sure enough, he did. He had the 3rd most fantasy points from the slot on the 4th most wide receiver snaps from the slot. This guy was being moved, or I shouldn't say being moved around, but he became one of the most dynamic slot wide receiver options in the league. Probably one of the best things about CeeDee Lamb this year, if you just put the receptions and the touchdowns, all that stuff to the side, CeeDee Lamb really kind of established himself as one of the better route runners in this league. And I'm not talking, technically or anything like that. I'm talking just based on win rates. CeeDee Lamb won his routes 50% of the time. And I know a lot of you could sit there and think like, oh, well, shouldn't that be higher? Not necessarily. To win a route is very, very challenging in the NFL. Granted, you're in the slot, so you have like the whole field at your disposal and stuff, but still you still have to get coverage off of you to be effective. And he did that with a win rate at 50.3%. That was 3rd best in the league, if I'm not mistaken. And if you compare it to his win rate last year with Amari Cooper, his win rate was 38.4%. He's getting better at running routes. And he's going to be someone I think a lot of people are going to be kind of I could see CD Lamb being the trendy, you know, the non top five wide receiver that has a really good chance of finishing top five. And wouldn't necessarily disagree at all. But I think the only issue that I have with that is that there's no more Kellen Moore in Dallas. We don't know who the offensive coordinator is just yet. We don't know who the play caller is just yet. But what's his role? What's his value going to be with no more Kellen Moore? Kellen Moore was the guy that put him into the slot more often this year. If it's Mike McCarthy, you hope he kind of does the same thing, or whoever is the new offensive coordinator / play caller does the same thing. That's one that you should watch, because if they don't get the offensive coordinator hire right, it could be a struggle. I shouldn't say struggle season, because again, he's the clear wide receiver one in that offense, so he's going to get his volume. But again, if we're going to run with that non-top five wide receiver that can finish in the top five narrative, I would have a tough time buying that if they get the offensive coordinator / play caller hire wrong. And that's going to be tough to do, because I think a lot of coaches would be smart enough to put CD Lamb in the slot just based on how much he won his routes, but how well he did in the slot. I think, an offensive coordinator would not be smart to not put CD Lamb back in the slot, but you never know. You never know. Coaches can be a bit prideful because they think their system is, foolproof, bulletproof. Sometimes it's not. And coaches can put players out of positions of success. I think we can all agree that CD Lamb's best role is the slot wide receiver. He proved it this year. So wide receiver 5 was CD Lamb. Wide receiver 4, Stephon Diggs. 3, Devontae. 2, Tyreek. 1, Justin Jefferson. Wide receiver 6 on the year, A.J. Brown of the Philadelphia Eagles. 17 games this year. Little shy of 970 snaps. 88 receptions. 145 targets. Just a little under 1,500 receiving yards and 11 touchdowns. That's a solid stat line. That's a very solid stat line. And one of the big reasons I think for A.J. Brown's success this year was that this was his first full season since 2019. 2020, 2021, he would miss a game here or there. I think he missed at least 2 games, maybe 3 games every year. I shouldn't say every year. In 2020, 2021, first full season since 2019, and he showed his worth, showed his value, not only in fantasy, but just in the NFL in general. A.J. Brown was 11th out of all wide receivers in receptions, right? 88 sounds a little odd for being, for the guys that we had talked about previously, where they're eclipsing 100 and all that kind of stuff. A.J. Brown, though, was second in yards after the catch. Every reception counted, and that's something that you needed if you're going to be second in the yards after catch. You need, every reception that you're getting is valuable. And like I said earlier, maybe not the same way, but we know what he can do now with a fully healthy season. And it seems like this Eagles offense isn't really slowing down just based on Jalen Hurts' development. And even with Devontae Smith, who can continue to develop and stuff, and we'll talk about him a little bit later too. A.J. Brown's still going to get his, though. He will. And he's always been kind of the yards after catch monster. So there could be some risk in drafting him. I feel like there has been every single year, not just by injuries, but what if that yards after catch is more like 15th than second, or, even 10 compared to second? You know what I'm saying? it's not a guarantee that he can rack up so many yards after the catch. But understanding, if you understand the risk in taking AJ Brown because of the yards after catch, he gives you incredible boom weeks because of that yards after catch. Yet that yak ability, as they like to say. Wide receiver 7 on the year. The sun god himself, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Detroit Lions slot wide receiver. 16 games played this year. A little over 800 snaps, 106 receptions, 144 targets for 1,161 yards and 6 touchdowns. Amon-Ra is a very interesting fantasy player this year. You could say he was getting kind of disrespected in the draft process, and he returned insane value for where you got him in drafts this year. He had 2 games with 30 plus fantasy points, which again is super great. You take out those 2 games though, and you look at all the other games, he averaged only 13.8 fantasy points in the other 14 games that he played, which we need to put context onto 14 fantasy points. 14 fantasy points is solid. That is solid. Everyone wants to think that 18, 19 is like, should be average or solid. 14 is solid. So I think the best way to describe Amon-Ra is that he was solid this year. And I think a lot of people are, there will be some people that, don't believe in the solidity, as I'll call it, of 13.8 fantasy points per game. But you should, again, that's solid. That should be that's realistic. That is realistic, and that is solid. Again, you're going to look at fantasy point totals, all that kind of stuff, and you'll see him still within top 10 and all that kind of stuff. But just realize that those 30-point games do inflate his season total just a bit. But when he booms, right? And just that's a similar theme to really everyone that we had mentioned up to this point. Their boom weeks are awesome weeks that you want to have on your team. Just understanding though that sometimes they are not as solidified in terms of production, right? AJ Brown with the yards after catch, right? Just understanding, right? We're not going to overinflate the value, but we're not going to underappreciate the value as well. Amon-Ra is still going to be top 10 wide receiver next year. That's matter of the fact. He's still going to be a top 10 wide receiver next year, should be taken as such in drafts. But just understand what you're getting with Amon-Ra St. Brown. Sun God had the highest route win rate among all wide receivers. 56.1% of his routes were won, and that is incredible. That's incredible. I think it does beg the question, though, just being on the Lions, what is Jameson Williams' like implementation into the offense next year? What does that mean for Amon-Ra St. Brown? I think it's still, Amon-Ra is still going to get his. And if anything, I see Amon-Ra being the main option through the air to get the ball down the field. And when I say down the field, I'm not saying big plays, but I'm saying like 1st and 10, little crosser route, little slant over the middle, RPO action, whatever. Amon-Ra is going to be right there, right? So he could be a volume play next year. Jameson Williams then could be kind of the big play option who can kind of take the top off the defense and may score the touchdowns in comparison to Amon-Ra St. Brown. But the Sun God is absolutely worth having on your team. Again, Boom weeks of 30 plus fantasy points. Awesome. Love those. 14 fantasy points in all those other games that he averaged is solid. Is solid. May not feel as good as 30 plus, but just understand the 14 is solid. Wide receiver 8 on the year is Tyreek Hill's teammate, Jalen Waddle. And yeah, I don't think anyone saw this happening. Anybody saw Jalen Waddle and Tyreek Hill both finishing in the top 10 wide receivers with Tua as their quarterback. I don't think anyone saw that. Waddle played in 17 games. He played in 755 snaps, 12 less than Tyreek. They are the only two wide receivers in the top 10 that played less than 800 snaps. Waddle had 75 receptions on 116 targets for 1,356 yards and 8 touchdowns. Waddle's yards per reception were the highest out of all receivers in the top 20. He averaged 18 yards a reception. And he was the only wide receiver to have less than 120 targets in the top 10. Waddle, I think if we can give him the nickname, it is the, master of efficiency, the master of capitalization, right? Volume is not as great as some of the others in this top 10 list and even into the top 20, right? When we're going through 11 and 20 and stuff. Waddle's volume is not the best. He made the most of it. 8 touchdowns helps also. But again, Waddle is a special player. He proved that this year. He's a special player. He's absolutely, it'll be interesting to see where people put Waddle and even Devontae Smith, right? Your sophomore wide receivers. Even Jamar Chase too, right? It's going to be interesting to see where these third-year wide receivers are going to be on draft boards, right? You had Waddle, who was wide receiver 8. Devontae Smith, who we're talking about next, was a wide receiver 9. Jamar Chase played in only 12 games this year, but he was still top 15, right? So it'll be interesting to see where these third-year wide receivers, right, because trajectory development should say they should be higher up on draft boards and stuff. But for Devontae Smith and Jalen Waddle, they've got teammates that finish higher than them in fantasy. So, it'll be interesting just to see how, how people value and rank teammate pairings. Speaking, and I mentioned Devontae Smith as a wide receiver 9, 17 games this year, 1,044 snaps, 95 receptions on almost 140 targets, just shy of 1,200 yards, 7 touchdowns. I will summarize Devontae Smith with this. The Eagles surprised us. I think a lot, just go back to the beginning of the season. A lot of people were saying, can Hurts really take that step? Can Hurts really take this team to the next level? Can Devontae Smith really develop well just because they have Dallas Goedert and they then they traded for AJ Brown? So can Devontae Smith really take a step forward in terms of development and stuff? He did. He did. Jalen Hurts took a step forward this year. They're in the Super Bowl. Devontae Smith was 15 in fantasy points per game, which you see where he finished and you look at the points per game and you're like, well, right? But think about it. I mean, Cooper Kupp, Jamar Chase, right? It doesn't. Sometimes the best ability is availability, right? That's the cliche saying. Doesn't necessarily apply directly to fantasy football, but that's your explanation why, Devontae Smith is sneaking into the top 10 over, when you see the 15th in fantasy points per game. One of the most encouraging things about Devontae Smith this year is that he saw no less than 8 targets a game from weeks 10 to 18. Every single game, he saw at least 8 targets. And he was on a different he was moving at a different speed. And when I say different speed, I'm using that as a figure of speech. But again, you saw development, you saw a step forward from Devontae Smith this year. I touched on the third-year wide receivers and where people are going to put them on draft boards and stuff for next year, but just looking back again and reminiscing draft season in 2022, Smith and Waddle, I'll throw Waddle in this. They were two of the riskier, if not the most risky sophomore wide receivers for sure. Some maybe even risky wide receivers in general to take this year. And they ended up paying big dividends. And I think what that tells you is sometimes you just have to trust talent more than the situation, right? And don't hear what I'm not saying. I'm saying, and you know, I mean, Lucas and Cam and I, we preach this from the mountaintops. Situation matters, right? But sometimes you have to take into account skill levels and talents and all that kind of stuff in there as well. Devontae Smith, Jalen Waddle, situation matters. Absolutely. You know, Tua as a quarterback, I maybe I should say it like this: questions about the quarterback, questions about the systems, questions about the personnel. Sometimes you don't ignore the situation, but you take into account development, the ceilings that these players can have. They proved it this year. So now when we're looking at next year, right? So looking at the new sophomore wide receivers, your Drake Londons, Chris Olaves, Garrett Wilsons of the world. Who's going to be able to take a step forward? You know, if any of those teams that they play for trade for a legit or elite wide receiver one ahead of them, don't immediately write it off as that's a risky pick, because sometimes that's a value, just like Waddle and Smith proved it this year. So wide receiver 10, to wrap this up, wide receiver 10 on the year was Amari Cooper of the Cleveland Browns, which is hilarious knowing where he was going in drafts last year and now where he finished. Cooper played in all 17 games, 936 snaps total, 78 receptions on 131 targets, 1160 receiving yards, and 9 receiving touchdowns. And Amari Cooper was one of the funniest players for us fellas this year, because the contrast in home and away games for Amari Cooper this year, hilarious. Amari Cooper averaged 8.8 fantasy points in road games. And that number is saved by a 25-point performance in week 17, where he caught only 3 passes, maybe 4 passes, and 2 of those went for touchdowns. And I'm not including the game against Buffalo that they played at Ford Field, because that's neutral. It's not really a road game for me. But then you look at all the home games that Amari Cooper played in, he averaged 18.2 fantasy points per game. When he was at home, 18 fantasy points. That's a 10-point difference. That's crazy. Cooper averaged 16.1 fantasy points per game with Jacoby Brissett as his quarterback, and with Deshaun Watson, only 11.6. And again, that total is saved by that 25-point performance in week 17, where 2 touchdowns came from 3 catches. Not so great. But all that to say, the man, the floors and the ceilings, all that kind of stuff this past year, it, it makes it fascinating what's going to happen next year with Amari Cooper. Do people rank him closer to where he finished this past season, right? Wide receiver 10, pushing, are people going to think of him as a top 10 option, top 12, top 15? Or are they going to put him closer to like 2025 because of his production with Watson, right? Because Watson's a big factor in that equation. And Deshaun Watson did not look super great when he came back. Granted, Deshaun Watson has a whole offseason, all that kind of stuff. That's why Amari Cooper is going to be one of the most fascinating players to me in drafts next year. Because where do you put him? Is he closer to 10, 12, 15? Or is he closer to 10, 20 and 25, somewhere in there? I'm hoping, at the very least, that this difference in point total in home and road games is not the same case for next year. Like, I'm really hoping that we get a much more kind of average with Cooper, where it's more like 15, 16 a game versus 8 on the road and 18 at home. But he's going to be someone I'm going to be paying close attention to. Cleveland, just in general, I'll be paying close attention to. Nick Chubb, no more Kareem Hunt. Amari Cooper, Donovan Peoples-Jones, if he's still going to be their wide receiver 2. Any of their rookie, or I shouldn't say rookie, but the young guys behind those two, Anthony Schwartz, David Bell, David Njoku, who took a step forward this year. Just what's going to happen with Cleveland this year or this upcoming season. I will be paying close attention to Cleveland because let's say Amari Cooper is closer to 20 to 25, and there's a lot of positive reports coming out of Cleveland camp. That may be one of the steals of the draft next year. So that's our top 10 fantasy wide receivers of the year. And when I say our, I mean the top 10, literally the top 10. Justin Jefferson, wide receiver 1, wide receiver 2, Tyreek Hill, wide receiver 3, Devontae Adams, wide receiver 4, Stephon Diggs. CeeDee Lamb comes in at number 5, AJ Brown, wide receiver 6, Amon-Ra, the Sun God, at 7, Jalen Waddle, wide receiver 8 on the year, Devontae Smith, wide receiver 9, and Amari Cooper at wide receiver 10. Next week, we'll talk about wide receivers 11 through 20 to cap off the top 20 wide receivers of the year. So make sure you're following us just to know when that episode comes out, because that's going to be a fun episode. Breaking down situations and performances, all that kind of stuff of 11 through 20, where I guarantee you there's going to be a victory lap made by Lucas about good old Christian Kirk. So yeah, make sure you're following us, subscribed, whatever it is, to know when that episode comes out next week. You can find those and find us and keep up to date with all of us over on Twitter, FF Fellas. I'm Tyler_Plath. If you want to give me a follow, give Cameron a follow at CamLawFFF. You can give Lucas a follow at Lucas Wenzel. You can find the fellas on Instagram at the FF Fellas, and you can find the fellas over on TikTok, YouTube, Fantasy Football Fellas. Thanks for tuning in to another episode. We will see you next week to finish off the top 20 wide receivers of the year. Deuces.